Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 7, Stocks and Stock Evaluation. We're going to focus on stock valuation, specifically stocks that have dividend payments, and we'll discuss the different pricing models and calculate the price of preferred stock. So when valuing stocks, there's really two main components in terms of the value. First is, what is the cash value of the dividends being paid out? Okay, so if there are dividends to be paid out, we need to know what a value is that and what price we're willing to pay. Plus, we need to also understand or calculate the future selling price of the stock. And when with two of these components, we're going to have to discount it back to our present value. Okay, but really there's just two main components and discounting those components back to the present value. Now, there's no guarantees. If you recall, and the best way to take a look is to compare the bonds and stocks. So if you recall from our bonds, there's a lot more known variables. And remember, the bonds are ultimate liabilities that the company has to pay out. So they're more likely to get that cash flow. It's more guaranteed. We know a lot more about the maturity rates, right? So if you buy a 10-year bond, you know the maturity rates, you know the rates of returns. Now with stocks, there's a lot more unknown because we don't know when we're actually going to sell that stock. And also, it's not necessarily a liability, so we're ultimately going to be the last to be paid. So there aren't even guarantees in terms of cash flow. Now, nonetheless, we're going to take a look at an example where we know everything. Let's pretend there are no unknown variables. So in this case, we have someone who wants to purchase common stock and hold it for 4 years. Okay, so the company announced they expect to pay an annual cash dividend of $4 per share for the next 5 years. She believes that she'll be able to sell it for $40 at the end of year 4 in order to earn a 12% return on this investment. How much should Angie pay for the stock? So again, we're pretending we know a lot about this stock. We know the future price, but let's go back to, again, the two components. Okay, so first is the selling price of that stock, and also it's the value of that dividend stream. So again, we're just going to be adding these two, and you can see that we're also accounting for the discount rate. So we're going to be pricing or moving that money back to our current price or present price. Okay. So again, if Angie thinks she can sell it for $40, how much is that $40 worth in the present value? And again, how much is that dividend stream worth after those 4 periods? And we can arrive at a price. Of course, we can also use our financial calculator and determine what the price is. But there's a lot of assumptions are being made here. Now, to be more specific and more realistic, we can use 4 variations of a dividend pricing model, okay, to value a stock. And within these 4 variations, we're ultimately going to be asking ourselves 2 questions. First question is it a growth dividend? Okay, is there any growth? So does that mean is the dividend growing year after year, or is it being the same? If it's the same, then it's considered a constant dividend model. Okay, so there's no growth. Second question we want to ask is, what's the time horizon? Is it forever or is it finite? So if it's infinite, then it's going on forever, versus is it finite? So really, those are the variations. We'll take a look at number 1 first. So again, this is the constant dividend model with an infinite horizon. Okay, so it's constant dividend, no growth, which means the dividend after year 1 is similar to the dividend after year 5 to year forever. Okay, so it goes on forever, and the dividend does not increase. And yes, the dividend itself has an infinite time horizon. So it's a perpetuity in the sense that we can use that same formula that applies. But instead of present value, we're again trying to determine the price. And if we consider our payments as dividends or return that we get every year, we divide that by the required rate of return. So very similar formula. Now let's take a look at an example. So we have Peak Growth Company. It's paying a quarterly dividend of 50 cents and has decided to pay the same amount forever. If Joe wants to earn an annual rate of return of 12% on his investment, how much should he offer to buy the stock at? So in other words, we're trying to determine the price. Okay, they've thrown a little bit of a curveball at us. They've told us the annual rate of return, but they've told us that the dividends are paid out quarterly. So we do have to get this annual rate of return to a quarterly rate of return so that it's compatible with our quarterly dividend. So again, we have our quarterly dividend. Now we need to figure out our quarterly rate of return. Okay, so it's our annual rate of return, which was the 12%. And we're going to divide it by 4 because there's 4 quarters. So I get 3%. So now this is quarterly dividend, and this is our quarterly rate of return. So once we have that, we can plug it into our formula, and we get a price. Again, don't worry too much about the math and the equations. I know it's not easy to figure this out over PowerPoint. That's going to be ready for the homework. Now, next is the constant dividend model with finite growth. Okay, so we're still dealing with a dividend model that doesn't grow. That is, the dividends are the same year over year. But in this case, we're going to hold it for a certain amount of time. We're not going to hold on to the stock forever. So there's a finite horizon. Okay. So again, reminder, the price is, again, it's the sum of the present value of the annuity, okay, or the constant dividend. So it's the value of that dividend plus the single sum of the selling price. Okay, so those two components, okay. And in this case, we have to sort of, as usual, we're estimating that future selling price because we don't know what it might be. So in this example, we have the same company, okay, it's paying an annual dividend of $2, right? No growth. And it's decided to pay the same amount forever. So the company's paying out forever. However, Joe, he's only going to hold it for 5 years. Okay, so he expects an annual rate of return for 12% and plans to hold the stock for 5 years. So with the expectation, okay, so he's expecting or estimating to sell it for $20 at the end of year 5. How much should he offer to buy the stock? So again, we can use our TVM equations or formulas, but just remember, so it's that present value of the dividend stream over 5 years plus the present value of the price of year 5. Okay, so we have to move that money back to present value. And again, ultimately, we can use our formula. So we know that our PMT, okay, so which is always our dividend, okay, so that's our annual dividend. We assume that our future value was $20. We know the expected rate of return was 12%. And again, Joe is holding it for a period of 5 periods, or 5 years in this case, because it's an annual dividend. So we can see that what we're willing to pay is $18.56, given those assumptions. Let us now consider the constant growth dividend model with an infinite horizon. So now we are dealing with a dividend that is not the same year after year. Okay, it's actually growing, it's increasing, and we can apply the Gordon model because it's a constant growth and it has an infinite horizon. So the Gordon model, look at it a little bit more simplified. Okay. Ultimately, the price is equal to the dividend minus R, which is our rate of return, minus G, and G is our growth rate, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more specifically when we deal with our homework, but we'll take a look at an example. So in this case, we have peak growth again. Now they're paying an annual dividend of $2, but it announced that the dividends would grow at an annual rate of 8% forever. Okay, so that's our growth rate. If investors expect to earn an annual rate of return of 12% on this investment, how much would they offer to buy the stock? Okay, so this is a little bit different from our previous in the sense that we know the dividends are not going to be the same year after year. So first thing we want to figure out, again, so when we see dividend 0, that just means our most recent dividend. So we know our most recent dividend was at $2, okay? And we're trying to figure out what's the value of the next dividend, so dividend 1. So again, it's going to be that $2 multiplied by our growth rate, or 1 plus our growth rate, okay? So remember the growth rate was 8%. So 2 times 1.08 is going to give us 2.16. So if imagine you have a timeline, you're going to have the first is going to start with $2, the next period 2.16, and then we're going to multiply that by 1.08 to get the next, and so forth. So the dividend is going to increase year after year, okay? But nonetheless, we don't need to know the future values. We just need to know the dividend one. So the dividend of the next value, we're going to divide that by our rate of return. So that was 12% minus G, which is 8%. And that's going to give us a value of $54. Now notice that the rate of return must be greater than the growth rate, or else we have a negative price, and that will not work with the Gordon model. So now let's consider the final variation. Okay, so this is the constant growth dividend model with a finite horizon. So again, we have growth here, very similar to the Gordon model, okay, but we also have to account for the fact that it's a finite horizon. So think of it as we're not keeping the stock forever, okay, so that value of the stock is going to be a little bit less, but we're also going to be selling the stock as well, so we have to add the price to what we're selling, okay. So let's take a look at an example here. Quick Fix company just paid a dividend of 1.25. Analysts expect the dividend to grow at its compound average growth rate of 10.72% forever. So it's growing, okay? We know that it's a growth dividend. If we plan on holding the stock for just 7 years, okay, so we're holding it for 7 years, finite period of time, and you have expected rate of return of 14%, how much would you pay for this stock? Okay, and this only works too if we assume that the next owner expects also 14% on her investment. Now, let's figure this out. So we could use the constant growth model that we looked at previously. So we can use this formula, okay? We can also use the Gordon model, just because the rate of return is consistent, okay? But let's take a look at, again, using that first model that we looked at. Okay, so that's the constant growth dividend model with finite horizon. So again, we are ultimately trying to figure out these 3 components in this case. Okay, so first is figuring out the value of that dividend. Okay, this is really, this whole area here, this product of these 2 equations is ultimately figuring out the value of the dividend. Okay, and this is ultimately telling us the holding period, okay? So ultimately what we're looking at is we have the value, imagine that we held it forever, okay? The value of that dividend would be $42, okay? But because we're only holding it for a certain amount of time, we're getting it for a certain percentage, okay? So we're getting about 18%, think of it as 18% of the whole period or the whole value of that stock, okay? But we have to add the fact that we're selling the stock, okay? So that's this final part of the equation. So we have to add what we're selling it for, and that gives us our total price, okay? Now, we can also look at it from Gordon's model, and you'll see that we'll get the same price either way. So those are the 4 models, okay? Now, one thing to point out is that there is what might occur, which is more realistic, is that there's a non-constant growth dividend model. So, imagine a company, they just start out, they may not pay out dividends right away, okay? Maybe for the first couple of years they don't pay out dividends. Then they might be paying out dividends for the next 5 years with a growth rate. And then finally, after that 5 years, they might consider to pay a flat rate or a constant rate moving forward forever. So, and we won't go into an example here, but just note that you will encounter situations where you have to use different price models depending on the dividend stream within one question, okay? Because that's more realistic for a company. So just make sure you're aware of that. Of course, we'll go over an example in detail in the homework. So just look out for the non-constant growth dividends.